This video will basically summarize everything that we've covered so far this year in social studies. And it all started with the birth of Earth. Earth was created, however you believe that to be, 4.5 billion years ago. And we eventually got to what we called chapter one of history, the story of the first Americans. And this chapter basically covered the migration of human life from Africa, where human life began, to the Americas. And so if you kind of look at this timeline here, you can see human existence began in Africa 200,000 years ago. And from that time, there was a migration of humans from Africa to Siberia, where they then had to cross that land bridge, Beringia, into North America. And so we learned that 12,000 years ago, they believed that the first humans entered the Americas. Chapter 2 was really focusing on who were the first Americans, specifically focusing on their way of life or their culture. And we talked about how their culture started as giant mammal hunters, but at the end of the Ice Age, 10,000 years ago, the giant mammals died. You can't be giant mammal hunters without giant mammals. They evolved into hunters and gatherers. And with the discovery of planting seeds, the new culture of farming and agriculture emerged. And we ultimately learned that the first Americans were Native Americans, because native literally means first or original. And so that brought us to chapter 3. We know that the Native Americans were the first people in the Americas. We know that the second people in the Americas, the Vikings, came 500 years before Christopher Columbus, the man given credit for discovering America. And he did not until about 500 years ago, being the third to come to the Americas. We then spent some time talking about why 500 years went by without any ocean exploration. And we talked about some things scared people from going into the oceans, like sea monsters and boiling seas. There were a lot of obstacles that people would have to overcome, like square-shaped sails and not having a lot of control over your ship, and the bad maps that they had because no one explored. But even if someone wanted to go out and explore during this time period, they couldn't. And that's because you could not go and get a ship and a crew and supplies without money. And the kings and queens were not willing to spend money on ocean exploration. And that was the deal breaker. That was the thing that needed to change. So we then talked about, well, back then, who were the kings and queens in Europe that had money? Who were our power countries? And these were the ones that would, if you wanted to go and explore, would be the ones to ask because they have the money. And hopefully you can take a second and reflect and see if you can remember our 5 power countries. They were Spain, France, Italy, England, and of course, Spain's fart, Portugal. Now, ultimately, we know that eventually the kings and queens started to spend money on ocean exploration. Christopher Columbus is the proof in that. But in order for that to happen, we needed to get those no's to turn to yeses. And the reason that the kings and queens said no was because there was no purpose to spend money on ocean exploration. But eventually those no's become yeses. And let's talk about why. The reason is that for a long time, the kings and queens in Europe, in our power countries, were able to take this pathway known as the Silk Road to get to the riches in a place called the Indies. But eventually, a war broke out along that path, which meant that the kings and queens were no longer able to use that route, that path, to get to their riches. Well, they couldn't get there by land anymore. And if you can't go by land, well, then the only option you have is to go by water. And so those no's became yeses. And that is the start of the age of exploration. And that brought us into chapter 4. Our power countries are now going to sail into the oceans with the goal of getting to the riches of the Indies. Since they can't go by land anymore, they're now going to try and find a way by water to get there. Spain's fart, Portugal, was the first. By the way, they did not know the Americas were there at the time. Spain's fart, Portugal, was the first to try to get to the riches of the Indies. And their plan was to go around Africa to get there. The problem is, Africa was pretty much unknown. No one knew the size, no one knew the shape. And so it wasn't easy for Portugal. The first explorer they sent around Africa was Bartholomew Diaz. Unfortunately, if you follow the red line in the map, he only made it to the southern tip of Africa before he was forced to turn around. But that's okay. 10 years later, Portugal tries again. They send Vasco da Gama, and if you follow the green pathway, you can see that Vasco da Gama learned from the mistakes of Bartholomew Diaz and made it to the Indies and got Portugal the riches that they desired. Now, if you take a look at the dates, Bartholomew Diaz and Vasco da Gama, they are sort of the sandwich between Christopher Columbus. In between Diaz and da Gama, that is when Christopher Columbus was like, go around Africa, that's not right. All you need to do is sail west and you'll get to the Indies. But if you remember, that's because they didn't know the Americas were there. So even though he thought he sailed west and made it to the Indies, in reality, he really sailed west and landed in the Americas. We talked many, many times that he never even knew he was in the Americas, even when he died. Now, we talked about that maybe he shouldn't be given credit as a hero in discovering America, but he does change history because he goes back to Europe and says to everybody, hey, you want to get to the Indies? Just go ahead and sail west. And that encouraged other explorers to do just that. Other explorers like Thinker Dude, also known as Amerigo Vespucci. I call him Thinker Dude because unlike Columbus and unlike a lot of other explorers, he used his noggin. And when he went to the Americas both times, he used his powers of observation and his powers of mathematics to say, there's no way this is the Indies. It's way too close. This doesn't look anything like how the Indies are described. And he figured out that this land that he landed in, the land that Columbus had landed in, was absolutely not the Indies, and instead it was a new land that nobody knew was there. And if you remember, a German map maker, Martin Woltschmuller, put the Americas on the map for the very first time and labeled it, named it America after Amerigo Vespucci. And now that they know there's this new land out there, it's like, forget about the riches of the Indies. It's all about claiming land in the Americas. And our power countries start to try to take control of the Americas. So we color coded this map, and Spain was in red, France was in blue, Portugal in green, and England in yellow. We said goodbye to Italy at this point because Italy is not one of the European power countries that chose to claim land in the Americas. So we talked about the land that was claimed by the different power countries. Portugal claimed a huge chunk of South America that is today Brazil, which is why they still speak Portuguese in Brazil today. But then Spain started to claim land, and Spain claimed a lot of land very quickly. They claimed the islands here in Central America. They also claimed this part of Central America called Panama. And the explorer that claimed that land also looked to the west and saw what is the Pacific Ocean and said, I claim this for Spain too. And then Spain claimed this land here and called it La Florida, meaning filled with flowers, when Juan Ponce de Leon was in search of the Fountain of Youth. We know that Hernando Cortez conquered the Aztecs and their 4 million strong tribe in less than 2 years and claimed what is now Mexico. Francisco Pizarro conquered the 9 million Incas and claimed their land, and the Spanish spread out from there. And then in search of the 7 cities of gold, Francisco Vasquez de Coronado never found it, but he did claim a lot of land here in North America for Spain. Now, France also claimed some land. They claimed some land in what is now Eastern Canada, and then went down into what is now the United States. And if you remember, the reason that they didn't claim all the way to the ocean is this is the Appalachian Mountains. So they kind of claim to the west of the Appalachian Mountains here. So if you take a look, guys, the European power countries claimed land in the Americas pretty quickly in the 1500s. But, oh, real quick, just a reminder, my favorite of all the explorers was Juan Ponce de Leon, the guy who claimed La Florida. And just a reminder, I have traveled the world to get selfies in front of his pictures, or excuse me, in front of his statues. Here is him in Puerto Rico. And then again, here we are in St. Augustine, Florida, where he and his crew landed. All right, back to the map. So the one country we haven't talked about yet is England. And that's because if I keep the title of this map the way it is, I can't put England on the map. Because while all the other power countries were claiming land, England was kind of sitting back and snoozing. If I cross out in the 1500s, then I can claim some land for England. And there isn't a lot of land left to claim. But if you look at the map, what I'm highlighting here in yellow, that is the land that England will claim. And England will take a pretty long time to claim that small chunk of land. Spain claims all that land in red in like 40 years. England is going to take 126 years to claim this land in yellow, and they're not going to do it all at once. They're going to do it chunk by chunk by chunk. Now, the word chunk isn't the fancy schmancy correct word. It's really a colony. They claimed it colony by colony by colony. Since a colony is a place ruled by another country, these are England's colonies. And in all, this will be 13 colonies for England to claim. So if we know that we're focusing on the United States of America, that's the goal, is the history of the United States, you can see that Spain once controlled some of what is now our country. France once controlled what is now our country, and so did England. And so if we analyze these power countries a little bit, it will help us to understand the history of the United States of America a little bit more. We started with Spain, and we know that Spain called their new land in the Americas a very creative name, New Spain. And we talked about the fact that a colony is a place ruled by another country, and people who live in a colony are called colonists. We know that when the King of Spain spent a lot of money to claim the land in the Americas, he wanted to make money also. So his land was used for mining for gold and silver. And they also grew crops on huge farms called plantations to ship back and sell in Spain so that the king can make money. They wanted slaves to do the work in the mines and on the plantations. Their first people that they tried to make their slaves were the local people, the Native Americans. But that didn't work. Some of the Native Americans fought back and were killed. Others died of starvation, and many died of European germs and diseases. And so when the Native Americans didn't work, the Spanish turned to another source of slaves. They went to what has been used for hundreds of years already in Europe, and that was using Africans as slaves and sending ships to the coast of Africa, kidnapping men, women, and children, and bringing them back to New Spain in the Americas to force into slavery. And we talked about how that was kind of the start of African slavery in the Americas. So when we think about how Spain treated the Native Americans in the Americas, they murdered them, they stole from them, they enslaved them, they kicked them out of their land and took over their land. Certainly, Spain did not treat the Native Americans very well. But then we shifted over to France, and France didn't claim a ton of land in the Americas, but they did claim some land in North America, some of which is in the United States of America today. They called their land New France. And instead of killing the Native Americans or enslaving the Native Americans, the French took a different tactic. They decided to trade with the local Native Americans, which is much, much better. And they chose to do this because a trade relationship is a good business relationship, and that could be a positive thing both ways. The French had many things that the Native Americans wanted, specifically things made out of metal, iron tools, pots, and kettles. But without a doubt, the best thing that the Native Americans could get from the French would make their lives so much easier, and that's guns. Imagine the game changer that is for hunting. But trade goes both ways. So we had to think like, what could the Native Americans give back to the French to get those guns? And believe it or not, guys, it's a hugely important part of history. It's fur. The fur trade between the French and the Native Americans was huge, specifically beaver furs. And the French knew that the Native Americans were the experts at hunting, especially on that land. And so the French let the Native Americans stay in their land of New France, and the Native Americans would continue to hunt with their newfound guns and now participate in that fur trade. And so, at first, the fur trade between the French and the Native Americans was a wonderful, friendly business relationship. It was a give, give, happy, happy. The Two tribes that they traded with the most, the Hurons and the Iroquois. It was pretty good. The French would give the Hurons 2 boxes of guns, and in return, they would give the French 10 fur. They're happy. The French would go to the Iroquois and give them 2 boxes of guns. In return, 10 fur. The Iroquois and the French are happy. It was an awesome pleasure doing business with you. Great relationship until the French started to get a little greedy. And instead of trading with both tribes, they kind of decided to pit the two tribes against each other. It looked a little bit more like this. The French would say, "Hey, Hurons, how many fur are you willing to give us for 2 boxes of guns?" And the Hurons would say, "Well, we always give you 10 fur." And the French started to say, "Well, hold on a minute." And then the French would go to the Iroquois and they'd say to the Iroquois, the Hurons are willing to give us 10 fur. We're going to trade our guns with them unless you can give us more. And the Iroquois are like, "Well, we really want your guns, so we'll give you 20 fur." And the French are like, "Oh, okay, but hold on, we'll get back to you." And then the French would go back to the Hurons and say, "Hey, Hurons, the Iroquois, they're willing to give us 20 fur. We're totally going to trade with them unless you could give us more than that." And the Hurons are like, "Gosh, I guess we can give you 30 fur." And the French are like, "Well, that's better, but we'll get back to you." So then they go back to the Iroquois and they're like, "Listen, Iroquois, Hurons are willing to give us 30 fur for these 2 boxes of guns. We're going to go ahead and trade with them unless you can up the offer." But the Iroquois, eventually you can't promise what you can't get. And so the Iroquois are like, "But we can't go any higher than that." And so the French say, "Well, then you're not getting our guns and we're going to trade with the Hurons." And of course, now the Iroquois are upset because the Hurons lost the fur trade for them. And the Hurons are upset because now they have to give the French 30 fur instead of the 10 they originally gave because the Iroquois kept up in the offer. And so these two tribes started to fight and weaken one another. And what did the French do to stop the fighting? Well, they did nothing. They figured the weaker the tribes, the easier they were to manipulate. So when we talk about how the French treated the Native Americans, they tricked them, they manipulated them, definitely sneaky, but not as bad as the Spanish. So Spain treated the Native Americans terribly. The French, not great, but not as bad. Let's take a second and look at England. I'm going to stop the video here. The next video will focus on our main character from here on out when we're talking about the history of the United States of America, which is our goal. And it is all going to be about England, leading to the birth of our country just 237 years ago.